B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Moed Katan Daf Gimel. We're going to start 13 lines from the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Beis. Earlier on Daf Beis Amud Beis, we saw a machlokes between Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef regarding Hamanachesh v'hamashke mayim lizroim b'Shabbos. What exactly, how do we define menachesh, weeding, and mashke, watering plants, and that's plants, trees, crops on Shabbos? The Rabbi said it was more associated to chayrish, to plowing, because it softens the land, and Rav Yosef said it was more to do with planting because it helps the plants grow. And then the Gemara discussed the concept of menachesh, and we brought in the menachesh umachapeb in the context of kilayim, and now we're moving to the mashke part. Watering, again, there's this machlokes Rabbi and Rav Yosef. Rabbi says it's chayrish, and Rav Yosef says it's zoreah. Says the Gemara Tanan. This takes us back to our Mishnah. Mashkin beis hashlochin b'moed u'b'shvius. One's allowed to water a field, provided it's a beis hashlochin, it's an irrigated field, it's a field that depends and relies on us watering it for it not to get ruined. One's allowed to do that on moed, on chol moed u'b'shvius, and on shmita. So the Gemara is saying, bishlei moed. Regarding Chol HaMoed, I can understand Mishum Tirchahi, that the concept of watering involves some level of work, of effort, or B'mokim Pseida, Shoru Rabbanon, and the Chachamim said that providing it's not extreme work, which we saw in the Mishnah when it comes to taking water out of a well, but as long as it's not extreme work, B'mokim Pseida, in order to prevent loss and damage to the field and crops, Shoru Rabbanon, the Chachamim said one was allowed to work on Chol HaMoed, and we already mentioned earlier on Daf Beis from the Gemara in Chagiga Daf Yudches that the Torah allowed the Chachamim to determine what was allowed to be done on Chol HaMoed and what not. Elo Shvius, but regarding to Shmita, Bein Leman Do'amar Mishum Zoreah, also according to Rav Yosef, who said that watering is considered planting, Ubein Leman Do'amar Mishum Chayrish, and Rabbi, who says that watering is considered plowing, Zriya v'charisha b'shvius mishari. Does anybody allow either charisha or zriya during Shemitah? And since it's not allowed in Shemitah, how then can our Mishnah say you're allowed to water a field on Shemitah, even to prevent from loss? Omer Abaye says you're right. And when Shemitah was kept on biblical terms, indeed it was also to water the fields. However, b'shvius bizman hazeh, Shemitah nowadays is only practiced midrabanon v'Rebbi, and it's Rabbi who holds that Shemitah today is only midrabanon. Tanya, Rabbi Omer, it says in a pasuk, v'zeh dvar hashmita, shomoit kol baal mashe yodo ashiyashe b're'eu lo yigois es re'eu, and this is talking about Shmitas Ksofim, that if somebody is owed money by somebody, and then Shemitah passes, you're no longer allowed to claim the debt. And there's many halachas. We're not learning the halachas of Shmitas Ksofim now. But the pasuk does say, V'zeh dvar hashmita shomoit, that this is concerning the Shemitah, the renouncing, shmoit, to renounce. Bishtei, so why have you got a double term mentioned in the pasuk? Bishtei shmita is hakos of medaber, because the pasuk is talking about two types of renouncing, two types of shmitas. Achas shmitas karka, ve'achas shmitas ksofim. It's alluding to the fact that there are two types of halachas of shmita. There's the halachas of shmita concerning the land, and halachas of shmitas concerning debts. And what the reason the Torah wrote it like this, v'zeh dvar hashmita shomoit, is in order to tell us that there's something connecting these two. Bizman she'ato meshamit karka, only when min haTorah you have to renounce the ownership on the crops, and you have to make the land hefka. Ato meshamit ksofim, only in those years, in those shmitas, does the shmitas ksofim apply. Ubizman she'ato meshamit karka, and these are the words we're looking for, that the Brisa says that there is a time where there is no shmitas karkois min haTorah. In those years, iato meshamit ksofim, shmitas ksofim also don't apply in those years. So you see clearly in this Brisa, in the name of Rabbi, that there is a concept of shmita years which are not practiced, at least biblically. So Abaye said that according to Rabbi, there's a concept of shmita which is bizman hazeh, which is not practiced Minat Torah, and since it's not Minat Torah, then even though midrabanon we practice Shemitah, but these malachas, for example, Chayrish and Zereah, at least in the context of Mashkin, what the Chachamim allowed it. That was Abaye's answer. Rava Omar, Rava said, Afilu Teim Rabbanon, even if you hold that Shemitah nowadays is Min HaTorah, then Ovois Osa Rachmona, Toldois Lo Osa Rachmona. Those things that are mentioned explicitly in the Pasuk regarding Shemitah, then those things one's not allowed to do during Shemitah. But when it comes to mashkin, to watering plants, that you're allowed to do, since the pasuk does not mention it explicitly. Dichsev. As it said, there is a pasuk. The pasuk says regarding Shemitah, Uvashonu hashvius Shabbos shaposoin yeh la'oretz Shabbos lashem. That's the introduction of the pasuk. The pasuk says that in the 7th year, the Shemitah year, the land should rest, which would mean don't do any work, any activities on the land. But the pasuk doesn't suffice with that. The pasuk goes into detail, where it says, Sodcha lo sizra, you should not plant, you shouldn't sow your fields, v'charmacha lo sizmoir, and in your vineyards you should not do zmira. Zmira means trimming the dry branches. Esefiach katzircha lo siktzor, you shouldn't reap the plants, the trees, ves inve nazirecha, and the grapes of your grapevines, lo sivtzer, you shouldn't pick the grapes. And then again it says, Shabbos and yeh la'oretz, the land should rest. So the pasuk explicitly makes mention of zriya and zmira, of katzira and betzira. Now of these 4, 2 of them in the context of Shabbos are considered av malachis. Zriya is an av malacha, planting, sowing, and katzira, reaping. The pasuk here regarding Shemitah mentions 2 toildos. Zmira, trimming, which is a toilda of Zriya because it helps the tree grow, and it mentions betzira, which is picking grapes, which is a toilda of reaping, of katzira. So the pasuk here regarding Shemitah mentions 2 ovois malachis explicitly and 2 toldos explicitly. So let's see in the Gemara. Mechta, Zmira bichlal Zriya. Zmira is really included in Zriya. It means trimming the dry branches would be included in not doing something that's going to help the planting, the growing. Ubetzira, and picking the grapes, bichlal katzira, would be included in the reaping of the grains. So why did the Torah mention these 2 toildos explicitly? Lememra, to teach us, the ahani toildos, only on these 2 toildos of Zmira and Betzira, mechayva, you're chayiv on Shemitah, achrinaisa, but any other toildos, for example, watering, loy mechayiv, that you're not chayiv on Shemitah. So Rava said, even though we have Shemitah, and the Gemara started with a good question, how can our Mishnah say that you're allowed to water a field in Shemitah if watering is a toilda of either Chayrish or Zereah? The answer is because the only 2 toildas which are chayiv are either Betzira or Zmira. Asks the Gemara, V'loi? Is it really clear that on other toildos, those not mentioned explicitly in the pasuk regarding Shemitah, that one is not chayiv during Shemitah? This seems to contradict the Brisa. And now we're going to learn quite a long Brisa with quite a number of halachas of Shemitah. V'tanya we learned in a Brisa. Sadcha lo yisiz rav v'scharmacha lo yisizmar. We just saw in the above mentioned pasuk that it says that you should not sow, you shouldn't plant in your fields, and you should not trim in your vineyards. Eini elo zirua v'zimur. So that part of the pasuk only mentions the zriya and the zmira. Minayin, how do you know that lenichush, that uprooting weeds, uleidur, and hoeing, ulekisuach, and cutting the weeds, how do you know those are also asa? Talmud Loima, it says in the pasuk, sodcha loy, because the pasuk says sodcha loy sizra, v'karmacha loy sizmar. It says sodcha loy, karmacha loy, and again it's a discussion exactly how to understand this pasuk, but the Rashi or the Mefarash here, it's not clear it's Rashi, it's probably not Rashi, but what we're going to call Rashi on the side of the Gemara, it says that since it doesn't say Loi Sizra Sodcha, Loi Sizmer Karmacha, it says it the other way around. It says Sodcha Loi Sizra, Karmacha Loi Sizmer, is to tell us that Sodcha Loi, don't do anything in your field. Karmacha Loi, don't do anything in your vineyard. Loi Kol Malacha Shebesodcha, don't do any activity in your field. V'loi Kol Malacha Shebekarmacha, nor do any malacha in the vineyard. So for starters, we see that Nichush, Idur, and Kisuach, which are 3 toldos, you chayev in Shmita. But it doesn't stop there. Let's go further. Minayin she'ein mekarosmin. How do you know you're not allowed to trim those dry branches of a tree? Ve'in mezardin, you're not allowed to trim away the extra branches. Ve'in mefaskin ba'ilon, and you're not allowed to add supports to hold a tree up. Talmud Leimar, from the same words in the pasuk, Sodcha loy, Karmacha loy, loy kol malacha shebesodcha, you're not allowed to do any activity in your field, v'loy kol malacha shebekarmacha, nor in your vineyard. Continues the Brayso, minayin she'ein mezablin, how do you know you're not allowed to fertilize the fields during Shemitah? Ve'ein mefarkin, you're not allowed to remove the stones from around the trees from the roots. Ve'in ma'avkin, you're not allowed to place dust and earth over the roots if they become exposed. Ve'in ma'ashnin be'ilon, you're not allowed to do some procedure which makes it's probably called smoking, something like that, which makes the worms of the tree die and fall down. Talmud Leimar again, Sodcha loy, Karmacha loy, Kol Malacha shebesodcha loy, V'chol Malacha shebekarmacha loy. So this is another set of toldos which are also in Shemitah. But now the Brayso adds a few things that even though you might think you're not allowed to do, you are allowed to do. Yochel, I may have thought, lo yekashkesh, you're not allowed to hoe. And this is similar to Idur. And Rashi is going to discuss, if Idur is allowed, if Idur is not allowed. But Yochel, lo yekashkesh, you may have thought you're not allowed to hoe tachas hazeisim, under the olive trees. V'lo ye'adir, you're not allowed to hoe tachas hagafonim, under the vines. V'lo ye'mali nekoim mayim, and you're not allowed to fill up the holes with water. V'lo ya'ase ugiyos legefanim, and you're not allowed to make those ditches around the gefanim, around the base of these vines. Talmud Leimar, Sodcha loy sizra, Zeriah bichlal hoysa. Because it says in the pasuk that you're not allowed to plant in the fields. The question is that Zriya, the prohibition of planting, should have been inclusive in the klal, in the rule. Because the pasuk started, Ubashonu Ashvius, Shabbos in Yeloretz, Shabbos Lashem, the land should rest. V'lomo Yotza, why does the Torah explicitly exclude, so to speak, Zriya and mention it independently? In order you should compare all those things that are aser to Zriya. To tell you that ma Zriya miyuchedes, in the same way as planting is unique, that it's avodas shebesodeh v'shebekerem, they apply also to the fields, also to the vineyards. Afkol, so too, any type of activity is only aser shehi avodah shebesodeh v'shebekerem, if it's unique to both the fields and the vineyards. However, Yekashkesh tachas hazeisim, Ya'adir tachas hagafanim, Yemali nekoim mayim, and the ugiyes legefanim don't apply equally to fields and vineyards, and therefore they are mutter. But that's a long brisa. But as they say, to cut a long story short, what do we want from this brisa? We clearly see that there's a whole load of toldos which are chayiv in Shemitah. And this is contrary to what Rava said before. Rava said that the only 2 toldos you're chayiv for are the 2 toldos explicitly mentioned in the pasuk, which is Zamira and Batzira, and not Mashkin. Well, here you see that you're not allowed to do a lot of other toldos. Answers the Gemara Midrabanon. This whole brisa is talking about rabbinical prohibitions. Ukro asmachta ba'alma, and the pasuk was just like a type of a support for these isurim derabanon, but they're only also midrabanon. And since it's only also midrabanon, the Chachamim said that in the event that the field would get ruined if you don't do it, like if you don't water the fields, then it's mutter during Shemitah. Continues the Gemara, V'kishkush b'shvius mishari. We just saw now at the end of the previous brisa that in the last list of toldos which are mutter in Shemitah, one of them is Yekashkesh tachas hazeisim and Ya'ader tachas hagafonim, that you're allowed to hoe. Asks the Gemara, V'kishkush b'shvius mishari, is one allowed to hoe a field on Shemitah? V'oksiv, does it not say in the Pasuk, V'ashvius tishmeteno, that during Shemitah tishmeteno you should leave the field, unatashta, and you should abandon it, v'ochlu v'yoinei amecha, v'yisrom toichal chayes asode, kein tase lecharmecha, lezeisecha. So you see the Pasuk says that during Shemitah it should be tishmeteno, v'notashta. What does that mean? Tishmeteno, you should leave it milekashkesh and refrain from hoeing it. Unatashta, and you should abandon it milesakil, that you should refrain from clearing the stones in the field. So you see clearly here that you're not allowed to hoe a field in Shemitah, and that seems to contradict the brisa we saw before. Answers the Gemara, Omer Vukva Bar Choma, Trei Kishkushe Hava. There's two types of hoeing. Chad Avruye Ilna. One is just there either to improve the tree and the growth. Some say Ivruya means to pierce, that when there was an issue there that the land above the roots needed piercing, there was too much earth on it, then either way, Ivruya Ilna, then it's Osa. However, V'chad Stume Pili, but in a case where it's to cover up the cracks over the roots, and that means what the Gemara really means is that, or the difference, the Gemara, it's a lot of discussion here in the Rishonim, what Ivruya means and what Stume Pili means, but what the Gemara is saying is that when you're avoiding a damage to the tree, then you're allowed to do the hoeing. However, if it's just to improve the growth, but it's not essential for the health of the crops and for the growth, then you're not allowed to do it. Ivruya ilon osur, stume pila shari. It's only osa if it's ivruya, but if it's stume pila, then it's mutar. Continues the Gemara. Now we're moving to the topic of plowing during Shemitah. Itmar hachirish b'shvius, if somebody plows during Shemitah. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rebbe Loza, chad omar loika v'chad omar eine loika. One opinion holds that you're chayiv malchus, that you get the lashes for doing that, and one opinion says that not. So asks the Gemara, Leima b'derb ovin omer bilo kamiflegi. Can we assume that the point of their argument is whether they agree with what Rabbi Ovin said in the name of Rabbi Lo? The Omer Ovin Omer Rabbi Lo, Kol mokim shenemar klal ba'asei, uprat b'loisaseh, ein donin oisei b'chlal uprat uklal. And just a short introduction to what's going on here. We have a rule that when you have a klal, a rule, and then a prat, a detail, which should have been included in the rule but was excluded, which means it was mentioned specifically, and then again a klal. So klal or prat or klal, we say that we include anything which is even similar to the detail, even though it's not specifically that detail. If it's similar, it's also included, and that's why that detail was separated to teach us that anything similar to this detail is included. So that is the rule of klal uprat uklal. Now normally a klal uprat uklal is said completely in the context of asay, of something you do, or completely in the context of lois asay, something you must not do. Here you've got something interesting. In the pasuk we mentioned before, we have a generalization, a klal. Ubashonu ashvius, Shabbos Shabbosin yela oretz, Shabbos lashem, the land should rest, and that is an asay, the land should rest. And then we have details, but the details are in the negative, in the loisase. Sod choloisizra, v'chalmur choloisizmur, esfiach katzir choloisikzer, v'invin izirech choloisivzer. And then we have again a klal, a rule at the end, which is again an asay. Shnas Shabbosin yela oretz. It should be a land of rest, a year of rest for the land. So we have here a klal uprat uklal, but you've got the klal in the asay, the prat in the lois asay, and then again a klal in the asay. Now this is very different to a regular klal or prat or klal. So Rabbi Lo said this does not have the status of klal or prat or klal, it just has the status of klal or prat. And when you only have klal or prat, the halacha is that it's only that specific detail that's mentioned in the pasuk which is included, but any other detail, even similar to the detail mentioned, is not included. That's what Rabbi Lo said. So Manda Omar Loika, the opinion that says that ploughing a field in Shemitah gets malchus, obviously assumes that it's included in these details. That means when it says Sod cholei sizra v'charma cholei sizmer sefiach tzir cholei sikzer inrin izrei cholei sivtzer, included in that is anything similar to that, including charisha, including plowing, otherwise you wouldn't get malchus. How can you include something that's not specific? It must be that we do use the rule of klal or prat or klal, that even if it's similar to the details mentioned, it's also included. That's not what, like Rabbi Law said. So man do amar loika, les leidre ba'ovin amar Rabbi Law. Or man do amar eino loika, the opinion who says you don't get malchus, is leidre ba'ovin. He holds of what Rabbi Ovin said in the name of Rabbi Law, and indeed it's not considered a klal or prat or klal, it's only considered a klal or prat. And since charisha is not mentioned explicitly in the pasuk, there will not be any malchus. That's what the Gemara is asking. Can we suggest that that's how we understand the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar? Answers the Gemara, loi, no. Everybody disagrees with Rabbi Law, and everybody says that this is considered a klal or prat or klal, and therefore we should assume that charisha is included, and therefore if somebody does charisha plowing in shmita, he should be chayev. So Manda Omar Loika, the one who says that he gets malchus, shapir, we understand that very well. How do we understand the opinion who says you don't get malchus? Manda Omar Eino Loika, Omar Lachoy will tell you that mechta zmira bechlal zriya ubetzira mechlal ktsira. Let's look at the details themselves that are mentioned. Why do we need all these details? And we actually had this at the beginning of the Omid, where the Gemara already mentioned this. The zmira, trimming, and betzira, picking the grapes, should be included in the zriya and the ktsira, which is also explicitly mentioned. Why did the Torah single out amongst the details singled out? He singled out toildos that two of the toildos that did not need to be mentioned, lemeimar, to teach us that ahani toildos huda mechayev, as we saw before from Rava, that only the two toildos mentioned here, which is betzira and zmira, only they are chayev. A toildos achrina, any other toilda, for example charisha, which is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah and hence is considered a toilda, loy mechayev, that you won't be chayev. Asks the Gemara, and now the Gemara is doing a repeat of what we said before. We came to the same conclusion before in Rava, and the Gemara asks from a long brisa, that in the brisa we see there are details that you are chayev for other toildos that are not mentioned in the pasuk. And the Gemara answered that this whole brisa based on psukim is just a smachta ba'alma, it's just a support for rabbinical prohibitions, and the Gemara is going to do exactly the same now. We're not going to translate the whole brisa again, we're just going to read it. It's identical to what we saw a few minutes ago. Asks the Gemara v'loi, is it true that there's no chiyuv, there's no isam in Torah for any other toldos besides for the two mentioned explicitly, betzira and zmira? Vatani, we learned in a brisa, sod choloi sizra v'karma choloi sizmur, ein yelo zirua v'zimur, minayin le'idur u'lekishkush u'lekisuach, Talmud leima sod choloi karma choloi, loi kol melocha shebesodcha, v'loi kol melocha shebekarmacha. And we saw this brisa verbatim before. Uminayin she'in mekarsamin ve'in mezardin ve'in mefazgin be'ilon Talmud loy masodcha loy karmacha loy kol melocha shebesodcha loy kol melocha shebekarmacha loy. Minayin she'in mezablin ve'in mefarkin ve'in ma'ashnin be'ilon Talmud loy masodcha loy karmacha loy kol melocha shebesodcha loy ve'kol melocha shebekarmacha loy. Yochai lo yekashkesh tachas hazeisim v'lo yadar tachas hagafanim v'lo yemali nekoim mayim v'lo yase ugyes legafanim Talmud lo yimar sodcha lo sizra that zriya bechlal hoisa v'lo mayotza lehakish elea lo yiman lechoma zriya miyuchedes avoida shebesode v'shebekerem af kol shu avoida shebesode v'shebekerem. This is the end of the brisa, and from this brisa you see clearly that there's a number of other toldos that you chayev, and it's learnt out from psukim, contrary to what we saw here, that there's one opinion that says that you're not chayev for chayrish, even though we have a rule of klal or prat or klal, and charisha should be included because it's similar to other details. And we said no, that since the pasuk excluded zmira and betzira, it's to teach us that those are the only two toldos that one's chayev for. And then we asked a question, this whole brisa, you see there's other toldos you're chayev for? Answers the Gemara, midrabanon, that you only chayev midrabanon, ukroas machta ba'alma, and the psukim are just a mere support for those rabbinical prohibitions, but in truth, min HaTorah, they're not chayev for any toldos besides for zmira and betzira. Continues the Gemara. Ki asa Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, then he said that he heard the following. Omar, I heard the Chachomim saying that in Eretz Yisrael, before I came, I heard the following. and he said a cryptic statement which he didn't really understand. He said that the Chachamim said as follows: Yochel Yilke al HaTosefes. You may have thought that you get Malkus even on extensions, on Tosefes, V'nosiv lo Talmuda, and Liftura. And then they brought some source, some teaching that you're not chayav on this Tosefes. And Rav Dimi said, V'lo yodana mai Talmuda. I don't know what source they quoted, or my Tosefes. I don't know what extension they were talking about. I have no idea what this means. So we're going to have a machlokes Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan as to what this means. Rabbi Elazar omer charisha. It was actually talking about the issa of doing charisha in Shemitah. That v'hachikam, and this is what those chachamim said. Yochel yilke ala charisha. I may have thought that you get malchus for doing charisha in Shemitah. And what would be the source for that? The asya miklalo prato klal, because we use the rules of klalo prato klal, that anything that's similar to the prat is chayav, in the same way as the pratim mentioned in the pasuk, whether it's zariya, katsira, batsira, and zmira, it's working on the field, so to charisha, and that's what they thought. V'nosiv le talmud liptura, and they brought a source that you actually potter the imkain kol hani prati lamali. As we saw before, that why did the Torah have to mention also Zriya and Zmira, also Ktsira and Batsira? Is Zmira not included in Zriya and Batsira not included in Ktsira? Which is what the Gemara asked before. And the Gemara before deduced from here that the Torah is telling us that the only two Toldos you're chayav for is Zmira and Batsira. And you're not chayav for any others. And therefore, you're not chayav for Charisha. And that's exactly what these Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael meant. Yochel Yilke al HaTosefes. I may have thought you get Malkus for the extensions, for things not mentioned explicitly, for example, Charisha. And then we said, no, we have proof from the Pasuk that two Toldos are mentioned to teach us that any other Toldos you're not chayav, including Charisha. That's how Rabbi Elazar explained the quote that Rav Dimi said in the name of the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan had a different explanation. We're not talking about what you do in Shemitah, we're talking about when you do in Shemitah. Yomim shohisifu chachomim lifnei Rosh Hashanah is talking about the days before Rosh Hashanah. Min HaTorah, we'll soon see what's Min HaTorah and what's not, but officially the Shemitah year starts on Rosh Hashanah. That's when the Jewish year starts. So Shemitah starts on Rosh Hashanah. But the Chachamim said that you're not allowed to do work in the field even before Rosh Hashanah. And though that extension to Shemitah, the days before Rosh Hashanah, Yomim sheisifu Chachamim lefnei Rosh Hashanah, that's what the Chachamim said. Yochid Yilka, I may have thought you get Malkus for working on the fields in those days before. And then, V'nosiv lo Talmud leftura, they brought a source that you're potter. V'hachikomar. Yochel Yilke al Tosefes Rosh Hashanah. I may have thought that you get Malkus for working in the field in the extension of Shemitah, the Asya, because we learned in a Pasuk. The Pasuk's actually talking about Shabbos. That Sheishes Yomim Tavoid, you can work for 6 days. Uvayom Hashvi, on the 7th day, Tishbois, you should rest. Bechorish uvakoter, Tishbois, you should refrain from plowing and reaping. You should rest from doing those malachas. Now, regarding Shabbos, we doesn't need to say it in the Pasuk because we already have explicitly psukim, and we're going to see this later on in the Gemara. We have psukim that tell us that on Shabbos you mustn't do these melachas. Regarding Shemitah, the Pasuk can't be talking about Shemitah itself, because at least regarding Ktsira, we have an explicit Pasuk that says you're not allowed to do Ktsira, you're not allowed to reap in Shemitah. So then what is this Pasuk referring to? It's referring to the Tosefes Shemitah. Now before the Gemara comes back to these words of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan suggested that what the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael had said to Rav Dimi, or what Rav Dimi had heard from them, is Yochel Yilke ala Tosefes. We may have thought that you get Malkus for doing work in the Shemitah year, in the extension of the Shemitah year before Shemitah starts. V'nosiv lo Talmud leftura, and the Rabbi Yochanan said that there's actually going to be a teaching that tells us that you're potter. And we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan at the top of Daf Daled Amud Aleph. In the meantime, let's see the build-up of these days before Rosh Hashanah, that how they're split up. We're going to see there's the 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, and then there's the time even earlier than that. Let's try and understand a bit the history, what happened with those days before Rosh Hashanah, and then we'll understand why there's reason to believe that you should have got Malkus for doing work in the field before Shemitah starts. And then we'll get to Rabbi Yochanan, who's going to bring us this teaching that is going to tell us that there's no Malkus. But says the Gemara, My Yomim Shalifnei Rosh Hashanah, these days before the onset of the Shemitah proper, what does that mean? Rabbi Yochanan mentioned that when it says Yochel Yilka La Tosefes, it means the days, the extension of Shemitah, the days before Rosh Hashanah. What is that? Keditnan, we learnt in a Mishnah in Masechet Shvius. Ad Mosai Chorshim B'stei Ilon, until what point in the 6th year is one allowed to plough a field with trees, an orchard? Erev Shvius, before the onset of Shemitah, all the while that the ploughing is still beneficial for the crops, for the fruits of the 6th year, you're allowed to continue ploughing. After that, it's becoming clear that you're ploughing in order to prepare for the 7th year. That is also. Bishillel, they give a date in the year. They don't just say any time which is still beneficial for the fruits of the 6th year. They say no, ad atzeres, until Shavuos of the 6th year, you're allowed to plough. And the Mishnah says, it's more or less the same time. The date of Beis Shammai and the date of Beis Hillel is more or less the same time. That's all as far as an orchard, a field with trees. Until what point is one allowed to plough a field where grain is growing? Erev Shvius. From the time that the moisture is no longer there, it's finished, there's no more moisture from the rain, then from that point on, it's not beneficial anymore for the 6th year's crops, and you're clearly preparing for the 7th year, and that's not allowed. All the while that people are ploughing lita in order to plant mikshois or midlois, which is a type of vegetable, all the while they're still doing that, that means that it's not yet tichle halecha, the moisture is not yet finished, and you can still plough in a stei halovon. Reb Shimon says, if you say that it depends when all the while you're still ploughing to plant these vegetables called mikshois and midlois, that you're allowed to plant this in the stei halovon, that's very unclear, and different people plant and to different stages and different times. So it can't be that every person, the Issa for him to plough the fields for Shemitah is a different time than somebody else. The Chachomim have to give us a very clear cut-off point. Elo b'stei halovon, regarding the stei halovon, a field of grain, Ada Pesach, until Pesach you're allowed to plough, till Pesach of the 6th year. Or b'stei ha'ilon, Ado atzeres, or b'shillel oimrim Ada Pesach, and regarding a field with trees, it's till Shavuos, and according to the version in the brackets, that's Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel say till Pesach. So that was all originally. In the time of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, they said that you're not allowed to plough for all the way to Pesach or Shavuos of the 6th year. Rabbi Gamliel ubeis dinoi. When Rabbi Gamliel, which was a while later, when him and his courts, his Beis Din, Nimnu, they voted al shnei prokim halolu, on these times that we mentioned, the times of the stei halovon and the times of the stei ilon, the Pesach, the Shavuos, ubatlum, and he nullified them, he cancelled them. He says you're allowed to plough even after the times that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel had said you're not allowed to plant. You're not allowed to plough. They mevatel that and said you're allowed to plough. At this point, we assume that what they mean is you're allowed to plough right until Shemitah. Omalei Reb Zera l'Rebavo. Reb Zera asked Rebavo, v'omri lo Rish Lakish Reb Yochanan. Others say it was Rish Lakish who asked Reb Yochanan. Reb Gamliel ubeis dinoi, heicha motzi mevatli takanto de Beis Shammai ubeis Hillel. How could Reb Gamliel and his courts nullify and cancel the decrees made and instated by Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? V'otnan, did we not learn in the Mishnah? Ein Beis Din yochel levatel divrei Beis Din chaveroi. One Beis Din can only cancel the words, the decrees of a different Beis Din, Elohim ken godel mimenu b'chochma b'minyan, only if they are wiser and larger Beis Din. And Rabbi Gamliel or Beis Dinai were not larger and wiser than Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So how could they do that? Ishtoimim kashar choda. So whoever the question was asked to, which was either Reb Zera was asked by Rabbi Yochanan, either Reb Avo was asked by Reb Zera, or Rabbi Yochanan was asked by Rish Lakish, whoever was asked the question was just quiet for a few moments, and then Omar le, and then answered as follows. Eimer, it could be that Kach Hisnu Benem, that when Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel instated their decrees not to plough the fields right early into the middle of the 6th year, they made a condition, and they said, Kol haroitze levatel yovei v'yivatel, that should a later Beis Din see it fit to nullify and cancel this decree, then we're okay with that, and it's okay. And since they initially incorporated in the Gzeira, in the Takana, that another Beis Din can undo it, so Gamliel and his Beis Din had no issue doing that. Asks the Gemara, did Huhi? Was this concept of Tosefes Shvi'is, of adding on before Shemitah, is it something that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, they were the ones that first came up with it, and then Reb Gamliel undid that? But could it be, is it true that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, they were the ones that undid that? Halacha l'Moshe Misinai hu. It's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that says that you're not allowed to work before Shemitah. It's nothing to do with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And then automatically, if it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, Rabbi Gamliel and his Beis Din cannot undo that. The Omer Basi Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Reb Nechunya ish bikas beis charoisen. It was said in the name of Reb Nechunya from this bikas beis charoisen. He said 3 things were halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Eser netiyos, which means that if you have 10 young saplings, young trees in a field, in a field of 50 amas, in a base soil which is 50 amas by 50 amas, then you are allowed to plough the entire field before Shemitah, in the days before Shemitah, because we assume that the whole field is serving these young trees, and if you don't then plough the whole field, then these trees are going to get hurt. That's one halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Arova, the custom of the Arova on Sukkot in the Beis Hamikdash is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, and Nisuch Hamayim, the pouring of water over Sukkot on the Mizbeach, was also halacha l'Moshe Misinai. These 3 halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So you see from the Eser Netiyos is ploughing a field before Shemitah sets on. The halacha l'Moshe Misinai is that if it's 10 small trees in a base kur in 50 by 50 amas, you're allowed to plough it before Shemitah. So you see clearly that the concept of not doing activities in the field, not working the field even before Shemitah, is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And halacha l'Moshe Misinai just excluded a field of 50 by 50 with the 10 young trees in it. But how can you say that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were the ones that instated the prohibitions of working on the fields before Shemitah? So, Omer Rabbi Yitzchok. So Rabbi Yitzchok had one way. We're going to have 3 explanations how to deal with this. Rabbi Yitzchok said as follows. Omer Rabbi Yitzchok. Ki gemiri hilchasa. When it says that halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that's only shloishim yoim lifnei Rosh Hashanah. 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, the last month, that's where halacha l'Moshe Misinai, you're not allowed to work in the field. V'osuhani, and then came Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, Tikkun, and they instated mi Pesach u mi Atzeres, already from Pesach and already from Shavuos, you're not allowed to work in the field. V'osnu b'ditu, and they made a condition between themselves that kol haroitze levatel yovei v'yivatel can cancel it. So when Rabbi Gamliel and Beis Dinoi cancelled Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel's takona, they only cancelled what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel added, which is anything before 30 days before Shemitah until Pesach or Shavuos. But the last 30 days indeed is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, and that's something which has nothing to do with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and clearly Rabbi Gamliel cannot undo that. Asks the Gemara, V'hani hilchasaninu. The 30 days before Shemitah, you're saying it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, kroininu. It's actually not halacha l'Moshe Misinai, it's actually learnt from a drasha, from a pasuk. Ditnan, we learnt in a Mishnah. And this is what we mentioned earlier on, where Rabbi Yochanan learnt from this pasuk Tosefes Shvi'is, that Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein tzarich leimar chorish v'kotzer shel Shvi'is. It's certainly not talking about Shabbos, because even though the context is Shabbos, but Shabbos it already mentions elsewhere in the Psukim that you're not allowed to do Chorish and Kotzir. So what is it talking about? Can it be talking about Shemitah, which has similarities to Shabbos? No, because Ktsira of Shemitah is also Sharei Kvar Nema. It already says in the Pasuk, Sod Chol Yisizra v'karmecha lo yisizmoir. Katsira is mentioned explicitly in the pasuk regarding Shvius proper. It must be talking about doing a charisha plowing before Shemitah sets on. That's going to be beneficial to the fields on Shemitah. V'kotzir and reaping shel Shvius sheyotza l'meitzah Shvius, and reaping those Shemitah fruits which belong to the Shemitah year, that even though it's talking about now the 8th year, or the first year of the next Shemitah cycle, but we're talking about types of produce which have restrictions of Shemitah, and the Rashi in Ksav Yad explains this is to do with Svichin and other cases where even though it's Motzah Shvius, there's still restrictions on what grew during Shemitah. So that's what he's saying, that the pasuk that says Chorish v'kotzir Tishbois is talking about the time before Shemitah. So you see here explicitly a drasha from a pasuk that even before Shemitah sets, you're not allowed to before it starts, you're not allowed to work on the field. So it's not even halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Says the Gemara, that was Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Shmuel argues with Rabbi Kiva and says, Ma chorish rashus, af kotzir rashus. That from this pasuk, bechorish of kotzir tishbois, indeed it's a question that in Hilchas Shabbos we don't need to say it, because it already says elsewhere that you're not allowed to plow or reap on a field on Shabbos. That was a good question. So Rabbi Kiva took it to a place of Shemitah, not Shemitah proper, but to Tosefes Shemitah. Rabbi Shmuel says, no, we're keeping this pasuk in Hilchas Shabbos. What's it coming to teach us? It's coming to teach us that indeed Charisha is also on Shabbos and Katsira is also on Shabbos, but the two are similar. What would that mean? That in the same way as Charisha, plowing, there is never a concept of plowing which is a mitzvah. Plowing is always something you have permission to do, not on Shabbos, during the week, but it's something which is permission, but it's not a chiyuv or mitzvah. However, when it comes to reaping, we find a concept that there's a cutting down, reaping some produce is actually a mitzvah. When is that? That is cutting down the omer, the barley that was needed for the korban omer. So Rabbi Shmuel says that the pasuk puts together bechorish uvakotzir tishbois, do not do charish and ktsira on Shabbos, ma chorish rashus, in the same way as plowing is always only ever permissible but not required. Afkotzir rashus, the type of katsira which is also on Shabbos, is a type of katsira which is a rashus, not a mitzvah. Yotzok katsira oimer, excluding the cutting down of the barleys of the korban oimer, shehi mitzvah, which is a mitzvah and is allowed to be done on Shabbos. So that's what Rabbi Shmuel did with this pasuk. Either way, we see from Rabbi Kiva that Tosefes Shvius is a pasuk, it's not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Ela omer of Nachman by Yitzchok, ki gemiri hilchasa. Of course, it must be halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We saw before it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Eser netiyos arova b'nisu chamayim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok is saying that halacha l'Moshe Sinai is just there in order to tell you lemishri yelda, to say that in the event that you've got a field of no larger than 50 by 50 amas with 10 young trees in, that you're allowed to plow it in Tosefes Shvius. The permission of that particular case to plow, that's what we need the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Kroi, l'meisar zakena, the pasuk of Bechorish v'kotzir tishbois, according to Rabbi Kiva, is telling us that when the trees are already not young trees, they're older trees, and are not in that situation, not in that bracket of eser and netiyos, that indeed you're not allowed to plow the field before Shemitah. Asks the Gemara, V'kivan the hilchas l'mishri le'elda lav mamela zakena asira. Says, I don't understand that. Asks the Gemara against Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok. You don't need a halacha l'Moshe Sinai to say that young trees you're allowed to plow the field of those trees before Shemitah. But I have a pasuk to say that in any other case, you're not allowed to. If you have halacha l'Moshe Sinai that says you're allowed to plow a field with 10 young trees, it's included in that if it's not 10 young trees, you're not allowed to. So the halacha l'Moshe Sinai already incorporates within it a prohibition of plowing a field without those conditions before Shemitah. So what do I need the pasuk for? Elo says the Gemara, Hilchasa l'Rabbi Shmuel u'kroi l'Rabbi Kiva. You're right. It cannot be also halacha l'Moshe Sinai, also a pasuk. According to Rabbi Kiva, he has a pasuk. Rabbi Shmuel uses the pasuk of Bachorish v'kotzir tishbois to tell us about reaping the omer, that it's allowed to be done on Shabbos. So he doesn't have this pasuk to tell us Tosefes Shvius. So according to Rabbi Shmuel, he needs the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So either way, that was the first way of reconciling here, is that the last 30 days before Shemitah, that's either Osur Min HaTorah or Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel added on even earlier than that, till Pesach and Shavuos, and Gamliel undid that. That's the first, but here we've already seen that there's a biblical source for Tosefes Shvius, either Halacha L'Moshe Misinai or a Pasuk. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan said before, that when to explain Rav Dimi, who said in the name of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael that Yomim Shesifu Chachamim Lifnei Rosh Hashana, you should get Malchus from Bechoresh Vakotzer Tishbois. That's this pasuk according to Rabbi Akiva. And however, we said before that Rabbi Yochanan said that there's a drasha that undid this. What would that mean? Rabbi Yochanan said as follows, and this is another way of explaining how Reb Gamliel and his Beis Din could undo the Doiraisa. That means, we asked a question, that how could Reb Gamliel undo the Gzeiras? He needs to be a bigger Beis Din, it needs to be a wiser Beis Din. So he said that's not necessary because they made it tonight. The question is, what did Reb Gamliel or Beis Dinoi undo? So till now we understood that they only undid what was earlier than 30 days before Shemitah. But the last 30 days they couldn't undo. And now Rabbi Yochanan is saying no. Reb Gamliel or Beis Dinoi undid even the last 30 days before Shemitah. Even then Reb Gamliel said, you're allowed to plow. And what would be his source? Midoraisa, he found a pasuk telling us you're allowed to work the fields even though it's just till Rosh Hashanah, even if it's the last 30 days. Midoraisa botelahu, he undid it using a pasuk. Because my tama and Gomar, my tama, what would be the source? Gomar Shabbos mishabbos bereshis. He actually learns Gzeira Shava between Shemitah and Shabbos, the regular weekly Shabbos. Ma'ala alon, in the same way as a regular Shabbos. He asura, you're only not allowed to work on Shabbos. Lefoneo v'le'achareo, but before Shabbos and after Shabbos, mutarin. It's mutar. Afkan, so too regarding Shemitah, he asura, it's only osa on Shemitah, lefoneo v'le'achareo mutarim. And you're allowed to work on the field before and after Shemitah. You don't need to wait any time, not before, not after. And this is what Rabbi Yochanan said before, that what he explained when the Chachamim says, V'nosiv lo talmuda liptura, here we have a teaching that teaches us that in spite of the fact that you have a pasuk of B'choresh v'akotzer tishbois, you have a pasuk here that learns from Shabbos that it's mutter. Maskif lo Rav Ashi now questioned Rabbi Yochanan, Man do Omar hilchasa, the one who says, whichever way you hold this, if the 30 days before Shemitah was either Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, then Asya Gzeira Shava and Okra Hilchasa, can you just make your own Gzeira Shava and undo Halacha L'Moshe Misinai? You can't make your own Gzeira Shava like that. Uman do Omar Kra, and according to Rabbi Akiva, that it's learned from a pasuk of B'choresh v'akotzer tishbois, Asya Gzeira Shava and Okra Kra, could Rabbi Gamliel undo a pasuk, a drasha of B'choresh v'akotzer tishbois with a Gzeira Shava that they made on their own? Elo Omer of Ashi is giving a third explanation. The first explanation was that Reb Gamliel or Beis Dinoi, they only undid what was before 30 days. The second explanation was that they could undo the whole thing because they had a pasuk. Rav Ashi says no. Elo Omer of Ashi, Reb Gamliel or Beis Dinoi, Sovri lo Rabbi Shmuel. Do Omer hilchas gemiri lo. First of all, Reb Gamliel held, like Rabbi Shmuel, that it's actually from Halacha L'Moshe Misinai and not learnt from the pasuk. If it's learned from a pasuk, then the pasuk says B'choresh v'akotzer tishbois, and Tosefes Shvius stays. There's no disclaimer there. However, if you learn like Rabbi Shmuel, it's Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, and Rabbi Gamliel understood from the way the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai was said that the Eser Netios, which is the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, the source for Tosefes Shvius, was learned together with Arova and Nisuch HaMayim, as we saw before. And so from the fact they were learnt together, Rabbi Gamliel understood that the whole Halacha L'Moshe Misinai of Tosefes Shvius was only in a time when they would also do Arova and Nisuch HaMayim. So v'chi gmiri hilchasa, when was the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai? The Halacha L'Moshe Misinai itself only applied bisman shebeis hamikdash kaim, when there was a Beis Hamikdash. Dumya de Nisuch HaMayim, in the same time when they would also do Nisuch HaMayim, and the Ritva adds it's the same time they would also do Arova. However, Aval Bizman She'ein Beis Hamikdash Kaim, but when there was no Beis Hamikdash, Loi, there was no Issa of Tosefes. And that is something that Rabbi Gamliel or Beis Dinoi came to this conclusion. So they were not actually undoing any Doiraisa, any Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. they understood that the concept of Tosefes Shvius that was first introduced as Halacha L'Moshe Sinai and then extended by Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, Reb Gamliel and Beis Dina understood that the whole concept of Tosefes Shvius only applies in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. After the Beis Hamikdash, there is no Tosefes Shvius, and therefore they were able to undo also, they were able to tell people that not only before 30 days, but even the last 30 days, one does not have to refrain from working on the fields, and one was allowed to do charisha, one's allowed to plow until Rosh Hashanah, marking the beginning of Shemitah. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next year, we're going to continue from here.